Adam,
Yeah,
is this an ad?
this is an ad for Mutinex. Mutinex are a marketing mix modelling company.
Why do I need one of those?
Well, then you can model the return on every single marketing decision you do.
So you wouldn't do an ad like this?
You'll never have to do an ad like this ever again.
Mutinex Growth OS, your best decisions start here. For more information or to request a demo, visit mutinex.co. That's mutinex.co. Notoriously, early stage companies, they don't do any of that brand stuff, right? They just go straight for that existing demand. They do smart performance marketing.
Yeah.
You can measure it. You can show you're going to get a return. And then they sort of wake up one day and go, oh, shit, we forgot to build the brand.
Well, they don't wake up and think, shit, we forgot to build a brand. They wake up and they go, why don't I have a company anymore? I don't understand it, right? The Future Demand, I wrote for venture capital firms and founders because there was this prevailing idea that building a brand was what big companies did to make up for their shit products and con people into buying things that weren't very good.
Welcome back to Black T-Shirts. G'day, Adam.
Hey, Brent, how are you?
I'm good, man. Now, listen, you started an advertising agency.
Yep.
Why aren't agencies more innovative?
That's a good question. I think never underestimate the powers of tradition is what I'd say to that. So if you have got a big agency and you're part of a big agency network, then the ruts of tradition runs deep and they're very hard to change.
With all that creative talent, why haven't agencies come up with more product ideas, more startups? Why, in fact, is the agency model itself so lacking innovation?
The people who start up agencies are normally from agencies, and people from agencies normally know how agencies work, and so therefore they don't necessarily have the fresh thinking to break the model and try new things. Are you trying to introduce our guest for today?
I am, indeed, yeah, because he is innovative.
Yep, and he's ex-creative agency, isn't he?
He is. So today's guest is James Hurman. He's from New Zealand. Now, James is one of the most awarded, brilliant planners out there. He's also become a world expert on effectiveness. He's written books and he's got a course with WARC. I always get that wrong. WARC, yeah. But despite all that, all those credentials and knowledge in the world of advertising, he chooses not to work in advertising. He actually started an innovation studio called Previously Unavailable, which we're going to ask James a lot about. He's here with us live in Sydney.
Has he done anything else apart from Previously Unavailable before we introduce him?
Well, why don't we ask him?
Okay.
He's right here. We can ask him. Hello, James. Welcome.
Hey, fellas.
Hello.
Thank you. It's awesome to be here.
Let's start today a little bit differently. What have you created since you've left agency world?
Oh, since I left well, it was 10 years ago. We just turned 10 previously. What have we created? We've created, most recently, a couple of startup companies in the kind of research MarTech space, Tracksuit and Ideally.
Friend of the show, Ideally.
Friend of the show. And we created a new venture capital fund, which is, to our knowledge, the only venture capital fund in the world that really has brand as part of its thesis. And so we look for companies that, where brand will be the difference between them being a good exit and a great exit, right?
Revolutionary. Isn't that hilarious that you're the only one who does it? Like, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's great fun. And in, you guys talking about agencies not, all having the same business model. Venture capital all has basically an identical business model as well. And so to introduce something that's a little bit novel has actually been really kind of successful for us, and the fund's going really well. So that's been fun. Before that, we worked to create lots of different brands for our startup partners. And what else have we created? Oh, now you've got me on the spot.
No, that's all right.
Yeah.
That's enough. That's enough. Do you see yourself as a creative soul?
Yeah, very much so. I think when I got into advertising at first, I was the IT guy, so I fixed the computers in the agency.
Kidding?
No, yeah. So I did. I dropped out of high school and didn't go to university, and just ended up learning how to fix computers, and then fixing computers in the agency. So I compared to the creative department in the agency, I felt as far from them as possible. I didn't really sort of dare to think of myself as creative like back then, but in the many years in between, I've come to learn that actually, of course I am.
Let's go back even further, though. So you being the IT guy in a creative, we're hitting peak geek territory here.
Yeah.
Were you a geek at school and at primary school, or were you
No, I wasn't. So how did I get? I mean, I really just fell into IT because I went to, like I said, I dropped out of school and I ended up getting a job at the University of Auckland, weirdly enough, as kind of an office boy. And then the IT manager, he didn't have money for anyone who was kind of skilled or talented, and so he employed me, and I just kind of fell into it. And I was just young and had no idea what I was doing in the world whatsoever. But I wasn't. No, I wasn't geeky.
I think it's interesting when I think about the archetypal strategist. Very bookish, very well educated, very articulate, I'm not saying you're all those things, but was it slightly intimidating when you first got into planning that you had fallen out of school, you hadn't been to uni, you didn't have that same sort of classical education maybe that something, did you find that intimidating or did you actually find that a sort of real strength that you thought in a different way?
I don't think I thought about it in those terms at all. I felt like I remember the first probably like 6 months of being a baby planner at Mojo in Auckland. I was just like, I cannot believe they're paying me money to come to this place and do this.
Yeah.
Like that's just nuts. And actually, I mean, part of the reason I became a planner is because I was working with a couple of creative guys at the agency before that, where I was the IT person. And anyway, they decided that that they wanted my help on these projects they were doing on the side. And so I ended up, I didn't really know what a planner was or strategy was at all, but what I was doing with them happened to be that. I just kind of naturally did it. They had this competition called the Cordiant Scholarship, which was all the Bates agencies in the region they'd do this competition to weed out their like young stars. And anyway, in Auckland, I won it, which was mad. And so Andrew Stone, who was the CEO at the time, sort of announced the whole agency that they're sending the IT guy to compete against the people in Australia. And so I came to Australia and I competed, and I didn't win, but I came a close second. And they were really, really buzzed out that I was the IT guy. And one of them said, "I think you'd make a really good planner." And I had no idea what that is, but I was like, "Yep, okay." And then he said, come to our planning departments and spend a week in each in Sydney and Melbourne and see what you think." And anyway, I saw what I thought and I was like, this is awesome. I love this. And so I didn't really have, it wasn't like I was surrounded by bookish British planners and intimidated by them at all. I just had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah.
I was just kind of doing what came naturally and what I really enjoyed.
So who did you learn planning from?
Well, John Steele's book.
Yeah. You just read that and just made it all up.
Yeah,
And
read that. I mean, it was one of those like delightful things where I just kind of chanced my way into something that I felt came very, very naturally to me.
I had no idea you were so profoundly uneducated for the role that you have become one of the global stars in.
Well, he's become a global educator.
Educator
in marketing
in something
science and marketing effectiveness and
This is
Don't tell anyone.
whatever you do. That's incredible. The other interesting thing I think about you is you had a creative partner who was Nick Worthington, who's been a guest of the show before as well. He's really good creatively. Like, he's a very, very creative person and really good.
Yeah.
I wonder if him being your creative partner stopped you from identifying even more creatively because there was somebody really good next to you in the driver's seat.
I mean, I think definitely through my career, because midway through, I actually was a creative for about 18 months at Lowe. And so me and Josh Moore, who was just going there as like their head of art, and we were at a Christmas party and we were like, he was looking for a copywriter and we were talking about, would it be weird if you put a planner and a creative together in like a team? And so we tried that out and I really just ended up being a copywriter. And so I got to do the job for 18 months and learn just how difficult it is. And the peculiar sort of stress that comes with it that's really different to the stress that you have as a planner or as a leader, or, it's a really different kind of stress. And so I got a sort of taste of it and understood it. And so once I think that I ended up at Colenso with Wertho and with Smarty, I just felt very respectful of the creative people in the agency and their process and what they had to go through, and sort of careful not to sort of overstep that line. And it is, I mean, it's silly when you come out of the industry and you're like, why do we have these silos and only these people are allowed to be creative and that sort of stuff. But I do also think, like, they always talk about like a great idea can come from anywhere. The fact is it can, but it almost certainly won't. It'll almost certainly come from
Yeah.
the people that spend all their days every day, like honing their craft, their creative skill, like working that muscle. And so I think I just with Wertho, I mean, it's just so easy to work with Wertho because he could just take anything that I was thinking and like immediately turn it into something amazing.
But I do think, as a planner, you were very much in service of the creative department and the creative product, as opposed to I think without blowing smoke up your ass sitting right next to me, but I think your genius is your ability to really reduce things right down to their absolute simplest and serve it up in a way that could lead to great ads.
Yeah.
As opposed to what I see from some strategists, which is the show-off strategy. It's all about the strategy and the planner looking really clever, and then you hand it over to creative, like, well, what the fuck do I do with this? You know what I mean? I do think you always understood that your job was in service of the work, and if it didn't lead to good work, then it's not a good strategy, right?
Totally. I mean, I think, like, I always thought of it like the creative department is the customer of the planning department. Of course, the client's the customer of the agency, but the creative department's who's got to take what we make and consume it, right? And so I kind of always thought of it from that sort of perspective. And I think being a creative had taught me also what creatives need, and it's not complication, right? And so I really learnt that, and so I sort of knew what they needed.
I see it somewhat differently. Clients come to the agency for creativity. They don't really come to the agency and then expect the agency then to go to another department for the creative. You know what I mean? It's just not a philosophy I necessarily subscribe to, but obviously there's more than one way to get good creative.
Well, I think philosophically, I'd really agree with you. I think if I sort of think of myself now in the way that I run my own company now, it's really different to that, right? So I do really agree with that. I think back then we had a really good thing going, right? And it worked really, really well. And so I think in those days, trying to mess with that would not have been the right thing to do.
When you're on top of your game and best in the world, just keep doing what you do.
By the same token, I don't think any of us stayed in our lanes. I don't think that all you did was strategies and briefs and that all Nick did was creative and that all I did was run the business. I think we were able to, work together on stuff, collaborate on stuff, and we all work together. Because we've talked a bit about that on this show.
James is just shaking his head.
That's what you thought.
That's what you and Nick did, and I should have just stayed my lane. But because we've talked a bit on this show about it's a bit of an old-fashioned view that like you're the business guy and I'm the creative guy, and you stay in your lane, and I'll stay in my lane, and I do think when creativity is really kind of happening, we all get involved, right?
I agree, but I think a lot of that is because of the respect between each of those people, a lot of which you nurtured, right? Like, I know you're a way better suit than I am, or agency leader than I am. You know I'm a better planner than you, and we both know Nick's a better creative than, when you feel that respect towards each other, you can let your guard down, right?
And it's a bit like what you said before. You can contribute, but you know who's boss of their respective discipline.
But
not even boss, who's excellent. When you're surrounded by people who are fucking excellent at what they do, you don't need to worry about them
you
doing
don't need
it.
to worry about that.
There's two sides to that. I agree with you. There's this, I respect what you do, but I also think the best people I've worked with are very confident and let you in. Whereas I find people who aren't as good are defensive and don't want to let you in. They want to protect their idea. And I think what idea hasn't got better from more people getting involved? It's just the right people getting involved at the right time in the right way. You said, though, you've now started a company and it's very different to how you thought about creativity in an agency. So tell us about that. What's the philosophy on which you found it, and what's the culture like?
And why didn't you just start a new agency?
At the time, I was running Y&R in New Zealand, and we'd sort of led it through a transformation from an agency that really should have just been closed and left consigned to history into a place that was starting to go okay. But that's a tiring, that wears you out. When you're the CEO of the agency, unless you're very, very disciplined, it takes you away from doing the thinking and you do a lot of the administration, right? And so I didn't enjoy that so much. I miss being strategic and creative. And I also was really, really fond of when we got to be creative beyond the advertising, when we got to be creative about the product or things that were more central to the company. And so I really wanted to work that muscle. And I wanted to take all of the things that I loved about the agency world and the strategic and creative process and sort of redeploy those on something that was more central to companies. And so that was me just following my nose to where I would want to spend the rest of my life, really. And I had an awesome time in advertising, loved every minute of it. But yeah, I felt like I wanted to apply my skills in a different way.
And we're talking about Previously Unavailable, which is kind of, from what I understand, an agency that helps kind of almost incubate brands and then takes a share of the profit or a share of a business and shares, and then helps them use creativity from the kind of the inside out, or I'm sure you've got better words for how you do it.
Yeah, it's I mean, what we've evolved into, I, because it was me and myself, and no clients or income, and just one.
I think
very
it's great you
worried
say
wife.
we though. Like
Yeah.
it is always good
Yeah.
to feel like a team.
Yeah. When I talk about the podcast, I don't say we, but joke.
So when it started, it was kind of, I mean, the first concept was an innovation consultancy, really. So helping like big companies do new product development and those sorts of things in better ways. What it's turned into now, so now we're, I'd describe us as primarily a kind of venturing company. And so we have a kind of venture consulting, which is kind of that innovation consulting and new product development and those sorts of things. We have venture partnerships, which is where we take an equity stake in a business, might be a part fee, part equity model with those companies, take a small stake, work with them on something, which is usually brand strategy and brand creation, but sometimes moves into product and other areas. Then we've got our venture capital fund, which we raised last year. We're just raising our next fund now. Then we've got our venture studio, which actually creates companies. And then we've got kind of venture media, so Caffeine, which is like the daily news media for the startup ecosystem in New Zealand, which is part of us kind of like trying to lift up New Zealand's startup kind of capability and ensure that we're becoming better and better and better at creating extraordinary companies, which we believe will pay off in the long term.
Coming back to the we, I know you're very passionate about the company you've built, the culture you've built, and really looking after the people that work for you. So tell us a bit about that. How have you thought about that, and how have you brought that to life?
Well, probably going back to the creativity conversation, I think like one of the things that like I consider all the people in our company creative people, right? And so we have people that come from engineering backgrounds, people that come from like strategy backgrounds like me, people who come from design backgrounds, people like a really broad range. But I see us as a creative company full of creative people. We're called Previously Unavailable because we like things that didn't exist before. You know, it's that simple. And we're a collection of people that just loves new things and coming up with them and nurturing them and kind of bringing them into the world. And so that would be the first thing, is just kind of everyone in our company is creative, but we've got no ex-agency creatives.
Why?
And why no agency creatives? Never found the right one, really. I mean, there's someone in my mind who I can't really talk about who might at one point join us. So I'm not at all, anti hiring advertising creatives, but I think there's just, it's just a very particular sort of thing that we do, and it's very different to advertising creative.
Coming back to the ruts of tradition and so forth, I'm amazed at how you're taught advertising. It teaches you about 1P, about the communications. And most people on the food chain kind of realise that that's a misgiving. But maybe because the creators are ultimately responsible for the advertising, they tend to get stuck in that P more than anybody else, thinking the answer to everything is an ad, or as opposed to coming back a little bit. I've found over the years that's...
And I think when that's constantly the brief and you're constantly conditioned to do that, it's very easy to fall into that pattern. I'm not sure it's sort of a lacking on their part. It's just the environment that they're put in. Yeah, and their training.
I would though, as someone who has left agencies and now finds myself in the corporate world, I actually think, and it may be because I didn't grow up as a creative, I grew up in account management and agencies, but I actually think what agencies teach you is how to influence. And I think it's an incredible skill that a lot of agency people don't realise that they have. It teaches you how to, really listen to stakeholders, understand stakeholders, manage stakeholders, and ultimately use persuasion and influence to get an idea through a corporation where you don't have any of the power. You don't have the money, you don't have the approval rights. All you have is your influence. And then when you put that into a corporation, that becomes a really interesting skill set that I think is a bit undervalued. So I hear what you're saying. It is 1P and it's very focused on communications, but I think there are some bigger skills that we learn in agencies that are maybe undervalued.
Yeah,
You know?
great.
Yeah.
I'd like to translate those into stuff that's not advertising. I'd like the industry to do that more because there's so much more value that they can unlock within an organisation.
And that's surely what you've
Yeah.
found, right? I mean, I think
Totally.
you're using those skills
Yeah.
to talk
Well-
to venture capitalists, to talk to
Yeah.
founders. You're using those skills in different ways, right?
I mean, something I say to founders all the time is it's easy to have a world-changing idea. It's much harder to convince the world to let you change it.
yeah.
And that is that persuasion, that persuasive ability that we have when we are creative and we understand how brands work and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think also like the 4Ps thing, it's quite interesting because one of the first projects I got to work on in advertising was for this bread brand called Mackenzie's. Actually, let me go back a step. We were working with Goodman Fielder, her big baker. They came in one day. Their head baker brought in his like experiment breads that he had been baking in back in the bakery. He had like a yogurt bread and a walnut bread and like all this crazy stuff. And then he had this one like really big giant white loaf that he kind of thudded down on the table, and he proudly said, "It's so big it won't fit in your toaster." And he called it Hungry Man Bread. Which was a shit name, and he and afterwards, like he left, and we were kind of going, oh, there's something really in that big kind of that big thing of bread, and it's sort of like maybe it like kind of reminds you of the generosity of past and like how things would have been like that. And anyway, we got going on that, and my boss at the time had this farm in Mackenzie country in the South Island in New Zealand. It's like a sheep station. And so we were thinking about sheep stations in like the 1800s, and I found these diaries of this woman called Lady Barker who had moved to Southland in the 1830s, I think, and they were all her diaries, and they described her. She was like the mum on the sheep station, and so she would feed all the men. And she actually bought this 4-pound loaf from this bakery down the road. So we called it Mackenzie, and we started to think about like how to kind of do this, like really kind of sell this. And so it started with the product, which was this big thing, too big to fit in your toaster. Then we packaged it in brown paper, which was like at the time, everything was plastic. And then we priced it. It was more expensive, right? But it justified the price premium. And then for the launch, we did like brown paper inserts in the like New Zealand Herald. This was a long time ago when you did that sort of thing. And so we covered off the 4Ps, right? And each of those Ps was sort of in some way creative. And so I think probably getting that grounding like so early in my career that you can think way more broadly than the promotional P, I think that probably informed like a lot of how I lent into my career, and is probably part of the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing now.
Adam,
Yeah?
is this an ad?
This is an ad for Mutinex. Mutinex are a marketing mix modelling company.
Why do I need one of those?
Well, then you can model the return on every single marketing decision you do.
So you wouldn't do an ad like this?
You would never have to do an ad like this ever again.
Mutinex Growth OS, your best decisions start here. For more information or to request a demo, visit mutinex.co. That's mutinex.co. But you've still got a little toe in the advertising world, right? Like,
Yeah.
so you've become this worldwide effectiveness expert. You wrote a great book called The Case for Creativity. You're now teaching effectiveness to marketers all around the word. You know, why? I mean, like, you know, aren't you busy doing all this venturing and innovation? Like, why still be involved in advertising?
It's really weird, isn't it? Like, because I'm not sure. I found like all of the, or most of the sort of community of effectiveness, us effectiveness nerds, just happened to, like, there's some weird gene we have that makes us want to like spend weekends looking at spreadsheets of like enormous amounts of marketing data and trying to spot patterns in it. I can't really explain why that is. I don't know, but it just kind of captured me, and I just really enjoyed the kind of the challenge of like working with data and trying to extract patterns and principles and interesting stuff from it. And then I just really enjoyed kind of teaching it. I really enjoyed watching the whole. I mean, we've been through a renaissance as a marketing and advertising community. When I started, there was no like. Well, there probably was marketing science hidden away in universities and in journals and stuff, but there wasn't like what we have now. There was no
amazing,
IPA,
isn't
and there
it?
was it's really, really great. And so I just think like, wow, we kind of cracked the code, and in many ways, like as marketers, we now like for the first time we look like we know what we're doing, which is awesome. And so I just kind of delight in that a bit, and it's fun to teach it, and yeah, I've found it fascinating and know lots about it now, and yeah.
If you had 2 minutes, or if you had a minute to kind of describe the relationship between creativity and effectiveness, how would you? What are the elements of creativity that lead to effectiveness?
Yeah. So my old school answer, like back from Case for Creativity days, would have been like, there's much academic research which shows that creativity does a few things in order. Like it stands out more for starters. It's more likely to be remembered and leave a kind of memory imprint. It's more likely to create fame for a brand. It's more likely to be persuasive in certain ways, and all of that is more likely to ladder up to an outcome. The way that I've started to think about it recently, which is kind of it's based on my latest book, which is called Future Demand. And Future Demand is like a really simple principle that in any market there are two types of demand. There's what I call existing demand, which is people who are in the category and wanting to buy now. And there's what I call future demand, which is people who will come into the category later. When we look at how those two groups interact with information of any kind, if you're in the market, you are likely to read rational information about features and benefits and reviews and where can I get it and how much does it cost and all that kind of stuff. That's very relevant to you at that point in time, and there's a very low cognitive cost of consuming that because there's a certain reward for it. If you're out of market, you ignore all of that. You just filter it out without even noticing it, right? If you want to build brand, which is effectively building familiarity among people who aren't in the market yet, so they'll gravitate towards you when they come into it. If you want to do that job, you actually need to earn the attention of a whole group of people for which your category is currently irrelevant, right? And so I'll use like the Jean-Claude Van Damme Epic Split Volvo trucks ad, right? So that did a really good job. It was very effective at getting truck purchasers to purchase Volvo trucks that year. But the amazing thing it did is like all of us who will never enter the commercial truck category and all the people that would enter it over the years after that campaign, they all watched that campaign, right? Why? When you're never going to buy a truck, because creativity earned the attention of you, even though it's not kind of relevant to you. So I think that's a super powerful.
I'll build
thing.
on that, and it's something we spoke about last season as well, which I'm still toying around with, is this kind of the long tail of that. So not only did you see that ad, it stays with you. And it stays with you. I don't need to see another Volvo truck ad. If I ever enter the truck market, that that will be the image in my head that stays with me. So it's created, reaches a lot of people, and then stays with them for a very, very long time as well. I think it's interesting.
Future demand, when you talk to founders, venture capitalists, because notoriously early stage companies, they don't do any of that brand stuff, right? They just go straight for that existing demand. They do smart performance marketing.
Yeah.
You can measure it. You can show you're going to get a return. And then they sort of wake up one day and go, oh, shit, we forgot to build the brand. So how is that conversation working with these founders and startups?
Well, they don't wake up and think, shit, we forgot to build the brand. They wake up and they go, why don't I have a company anymore? I don't understand it, right? The Future Demand, I wrote for venture capital firms and founders because there was this prevailing idea that building a brand was what big companies did to make up for their shit products and con people into buying things that weren't very good. And what you really needed to do was to create a fantastic product and then put that in front of people and tell them why that product was fantastic. And then sales would go up. And sure enough, that happened. But the problem was that those venture capital firms, their portfolio companies kept dying, right? So they'd have this great 3 years, and then they'd plateau out, and then they'd be screwed. And they didn't know why that was happening, but it was happening again and again. But I was pretty sure that I knew why that was happening. And so Future Demand was really kind of a letter to the venture capital community and founders to say, look, this is why on this long-term journey from seed, raise to exit, which is usually 10 years, averages out 10 years, that's a long-term thing, right? you can't just worry about this year's sales. You've got to make it all that way through at least one economic downturn, by the way. Just throw that in the mix too. You've got to make it all that way. And so you need to be thinking about who's going to be buying from you 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years from now. And you need to be warming that audience up before you get there. And it's made real sense, like just moving the language away from brand, which has not got a very good brand. And
ironically,
and using language that's that lands a bit better with people that are quite financially minded and a bit more rational and haven't sort of drunk the Kool-Aid that we've drunk being in the industry.
And do you feel like it's turning? Do you feel like it's a different conversation than
It's
it
totally
was
different.
5 years ago?
Totally.
Yeah.
It was really easy to turn as well, which is interesting because VCs tend to be really smart. They don't know the same things that we know, but they tend to be killer bright. And so when you can give them a really solid argument and back it up with research, then they go, okay, great. They're not trying to defend their ideas. They're very, very willing to hear new ideas and willing to hear anything that can make their portfolio more successful. So yes, it's been really successful.
And then when you're talking about future demand and you've laid that with them, what then is the process for developing ideas or for taking that product or so forth and creating that 10-year journey with them? What's your creative process to develop that?
It usually starts like right at the beginning, which is getting a company really, really, really clear about what its mission is, right? And this is another thing that, we tend to do in advertising. It's another thing that we get taught to think, or we just kind of do so much. Like being able to spot, like, what are we really trying to do here? What's the problem we're trying to solve? How do we articulate that neatly and simply and in a persuasive way? That comes quite naturally to us. But for most founders, particularly technical founders of tech startups, it doesn't come naturally to them at all. And it takes them a long time of kind of going in all kinds of directions to finally settle on, like, what is it we're actually trying to do? I know what I'm trying to build and like what the features are and all that kind of jazz, but what's the difference we're trying to make in the world? And so really identifying that very early on, that's really the seed from which the brand grows, because those two things have to be so kind of, it's not like we're putting a wrapping around the thing. It's like you're finding a way of bringing that mission into the world that makes other people care about it as much as that founder cares about it.
And then if you've distilled that and give them a mission, are you then going through the 4 Ps and saying, here, this is how it comes to life in the 4 Ps, or do you have a more...
Yeah, as ever, with varying degrees of success. So often pricing is kind of dictated by the market, right? And it's quite hard to just sort of set pricing sometimes, but sometimes we can do it. Packaging, like depending on the company, lots of them don't have packaging. No packaging, hang on, I'm getting my P's wrong now, aren't I? But the product, often it's already kind of set in stone, but you can affect things like the customer experience around that. Promotion, yes. I mean, very early stage companies, you're not doing ad campaigns as such, but you're trying to figure out how do we get this out in front of people in a way. Yeah. What P am I forgetting now? Product,
distribution,
price. Place. Again, it's so much of it, particularly in, the VCs love things that don't need distribution. They just distribute themselves.
And so
software.
It's interesting that we're on the 4 Ps because Ritson, friend of the show, we love Ritson, but he's been out pretty aggressively lately talking about the fact that marketers have got too obsessed with 1 P called promotion.
Yep.
That and within that P, we're too obsessed with creativity, and really where marketers need to apply creativity is through the other Ps and in other ways.
Yeah.
Agree? Disagree?
I agree fully in theory. I think it seems difficult in practice, and you can probably speak to this the most, right? Like, how do your pricing people like it when you say we should price things this way or that way? Do they welcome you into that? How do the product people think about marketing? In my experience, it's not that marketers don't want to do that stuff and are over focused on the promotional P. It's just that most of them are only left to that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is you don't need to be generating the pricing strategy or idea or the product strategy or idea. I think you got to think about how do we build the brand in a way that works because we want this sort of price or we've got this sort of... So you're contributing to the other Ps. You're not always controlling them. You're not always setting them. Yeah. I think that's the modern marketer's dilemma. Yeah. But I think you've got to be thinking about them, right? You've got to be thinking about, okay, how do we build the brand in a way that's going to command this sort of pricing market? And, often I think what's dangerous when you start doing brand and promotion in a vacuum that's not considering those other important parts of the business strategy, right?
I think that's really fair. I think and yes, absolutely love Mark, and he's absolutely right. But I think growling at marketers for not having access to those other 3 Ps, I think is talking to the wrong audience. He or those who feel the same way should be talking to an audience above the marketing department to try and convince them that actually there's sense in these areas of the business being more consumer-led or more marketing science-led or what have you. And this is related to something else I think about effectiveness, which is I think the future of kind of effectiveness and where it goes is going to be less about uncovering new principles, because I think we largely understand how everything works now. It's going to be more about taking those principles outside of the marketing department and convincing all of the people that don't let marketers do what marketers are meant to be doing, right? And we've got to convince that group, because I think I think we all believe the same stuff. I don't think there's a marketer out there who would go, no, Mark, you're wrong. We shouldn't have any influence on price or...
So even though, as you say, most marketers know the principles, why is there so much ineffective advertising out there?
Again, I think a lot of it comes down to there are stakeholders beyond the marketing department who are very powerful, right? And there's a kind of an explicit battle sometimes with those people, showing them work that they don't like for various reasons. And there's also an implicit battle, because when you think through, when you're a marketer sitting in an agency judging some work, a little bit of you is reacting to how you feel about the work, and a lot of you is reacting to how are all the army of people back at my office who sneer at me, like how are they gonna feel about this? And a lot of your kind of feedback and judgment is informed by that. So I think that's part of the issue. Part of the issue is, of course, like effectiveness and creativity is well understood, but that understanding is not evenly distributed for sure. And so there's pockets where it's not being, where people are getting it all wrong. But I feel sympathy with marketers, because they're in a really challenging position that sometimes as agency people is difficult to understand.
So are you saying that even if you've got all the principles and knowledge about marketing effectiveness, you could still make a average ad?
Of course.
Well, here's one you made.
So that was great. What a great segue. I did not even see that coming. That was perfect.
So look, one thing we like to do on this show is the pub test.
Yeah.
And with someone like you who is such a big thinker, how do we test these venture ideas and companies James is forming? We thought, no, we'll actually test a bit of advertising that James created.
Let's play the ad first.
Yes.
And then we'll come back and have a chat about it.
Hello and welcome to
the most effective advertising campaign in the world.
Which is this campaign for the Master of Advertising Effectiveness, a 6-week online program in partnership with Walk that'll give you a next-level understanding of the evidence-based principles of advertising effectiveness. The very same principles we've used to create this,
the most effective advertising campaign in the world.
Over the coming years, you'll experience a campaign that's perfectly budgeted and targeted over both the short and long terms, and replete with emotion, distinctive assets, and most importantly, creativity. It will at some point result in you visiting our website, mae.academy, signing up, becoming a Master of Advertising Effectiveness, and also becoming a piece of hard evidence that this is in fact
the most effective advertising campaign in the world.
Was it?
Yes. It says so right there. It says so right there. If with enough will, you can achieve anything.
So that your ad reminds me. Every year I put on a thing called the Marketing Sciences Ideas Exchange, and every year we've got the brief to promote it, and it's not as easy to apply what you know creatively as you might think.
Of course. I mean, ads by agencies about their agency
are invariably...
There aren't many good ones.
No. So tell us about the process there you went through to create that.
I was thinking about just really, like, how do I communicate what the program's about in a way that's not as dry balls as it kind of could be, right? Because... I mean, I find it really interesting, but I can understand why people don't find it as sort of interesting as I do. So part of my job as a communicator and as an educator is to try to make these concepts simple and interesting.
You're being a good sport. Let's also caveat this a little bit. I mean, it ran in very targeted environments, right?
This is true.
Yeah?
Yes, it did. I mean, I made those spots for
Fergus.
another podcast, the
Yeah.
On Strategy Showcase
Yeah.
podcast. And so they're made to run in that environment too. An audience of predominantly kind of strategy-ish people or marketers or, people that work in our world.
It's an important caveat. It didn't run on Triple M.
No. When you're creating these ads or any of your ideas, are you thinking what's going to be effective, or are you thinking, how can I get attention, or how can I be creative, or just if you could put a magnifying glass into your head a little bit, break it down for us.
In the case of this, and often this is the case when you're launching sort of something new into the world, you need to sort of explain it a little bit at first. Like, you can't be too sort of oblique about what it is, which is, of course, the wonderful privilege of working on very well-known brands, because you can take that knowledge for granted and sort of go to much more interesting places. I think, like, when you're explaining something, like, how do you do that in a way that's at least a little bit entertaining? I think in the education space, like, there aren't many people who kind of take the piss out of themselves and approach it with a bit of levity, and I kind of wanted to do that. That's something that Mark does really well.
Also a very New Zealand trait, I think.
And I just thought it was funny that, like, if I am teaching the principles of advertising effectiveness, then surely I have to make the most effective campaign in the world.
Let's subject it to the pub test, shall we?
Take it to the
Go
pub.
for it.
The pub test is brought to you by Dealey, the insights platform where ideas go to grow.
This is a great play on words, like marketing about marketing or thinking about thinking.
Not really. It does seem a bit hectic. Maybe a bit full on.
Yeah, I thought it was funny and really drilled the message home.
I think it does make me want to do the course. It's a bit full on, but I see the humour in it.
Yeah, I think it's catchy, the way they use their slogan. The most effective.
Unfortunately, I don't really think it's for me.
Advertising needs to be creative.
Yeah, the use of technology and humour, particularly the loud voiceover dub bit, that was cool.
Yeah, I think it passes the pub test.
Yeah, I'd give it a crack.
I don't think this one passes the pub test.
Yeah, I thought it was funny and really drilled the message home.
Yeah, I reckon that passes the pub test.
Wow, I am speechless that some people thought it actually passed the pub test.
Well, I think we have been kind in the editing there, because we sampled that with 434 people. 63% unfortunately said no, it didn't pass the pub test. 23% liked it. This is my favourite quote. Not my every interest, but I appreciate the creativity and cleverness of the advertising. So I reckon, it was a big ask for them to go.
You love a bit of pre-testing, James. How'd you feel about that?
I love a bit of pre-testing. I think, this is an ideally test.
It is,
isn't it?
Yes.
Yep. Ideally do a great job, and they are very reliable, and so I will take it as a sign that I need to up my game.
Why don't you, while we're talking about Ideally, you've obviously been involved with them from sort of day dot. Why don't you just sort of give us your thoughts on...
It's kind of interesting, because Ideally is sponsoring the pub test for us.
Yeah.
And Brent and I are both kind of heavy proponents of making sure research has knows its place in the creative process and making sure it doesn't lead. Yeah, it'd be interesting to hear your take on it.
Totally. I mean, that was where we really started with the thinking on Ideally was, most research says no to ideas, and how can we create a research tool that more easily says yes to them, or helps us actually nurture and develop ideas rather than give them a green light or a red light. So that was really the kind of philosophy at the start. And as we've looked more and more into kind of pre-testing research over the, it's come a long way over the last certainly decade. You can pre-test basically a finished television commercial, and now there are methodologies that'll give you a pretty good indication of in-market performance. So that's awesome. Well done, research industry. But anything that's not sort of a finished or very nearly finished television commercial, you can't test with any predictive quality whatsoever. So if you've got a billboard or a print ad or an activation, or you've got a partnership, or any of the stuff that we might do that's beyond an integrated campaign, anything we might do that's beyond a television commercial, we can't test that with any degree of predictiveness, even though most marketers in the world seem to think that we can, or they've been led to believe that we can. So I think there's predictive pre-testing, and then there's what I call creative development research, which is hopefully just tell me some interesting things that help me move this along a bit.
Yeah.
And that's what we've sort of tried to do with Ideally, is really point it more in that direction. It's not green light, red light. It's saying, here's some stuff. Let's put this in front of people. Let's get an AI to kind of take everything that they've said and summarize it and give you some hopefully useful things to kind of help you take this further and get it to water use.
And what about when you're working more on, in the venture and startup space where you're not testing communications, but it's more about business ideas, product ideas.
Yeah.
What tools do you use and how do you do that?
It's pretty hard with a business because you can't really test a venture in anywhere near the same way. So, I mean, most of the world's biggest companies, if you tried to, if Larry and Sergey explained Google like before Google, like 1,000 consumers would not have said that's going to be one of the world's most valuable companies. So it's much, much more difficult to do that. But I think, again, it's very much a creative development thing. So, I mean, I'll use a kind of an example that's easier to explain than a new venture, which would just be a new product.
Mm-hmm.
So when we do new product development, we have kind of this 2-stage proto-testing process. And so we'll sort of do a bunch of sort of insight research, right? What's going on in the category? What do people need? All of that kind of jazz. Come up with some ideas, and they're not meant to be right at all. In fact, we're looking at territories and going, how could we push a product idea like really far this way into this territory, and how could we push this other one really far out that way, and so on and so forth. And then we'll take those into groups of people and letting them we'll make a product and take it in and let people kind of tear it to bits, basically. So what we want to collect is as much information as possible about what we shouldn't do, and then build that into a next round of prototypes that take all of that on board. And we have a really amazing success rate at getting, in that second round, getting to something that people really, really want.
But you have to push it in the first round, really push to the edges and really sort
push
of
it to the edges, expect people to hate it, and find that really interesting. Why do you hate it? Okay, because that often leads you to figuring out what they'll love. And so that's the sort of development thing, and it's kind of like, it takes capable hands to do that, right? And to not get freaked out when things, people say they hate things and all the rest of it, and to sort of understand how to dig underneath that. But yeah, I mean, that's what hopefully ideally is starting to do for people. Let them get things into the world in really early forms for not very much money and get feedback really, really quickly, so that they can, it's not, everything's not riding on the research result.
You know why I like Ideally, Adam?
Why, Brent?
It's fast. You get insights overnight. And I think the main thing is it's not trying to test whether an idea should live or die, but it's trying to give you real insights that you can build on and make the creative better.
That sounded like an ad.
Because it was.
Do you know why I like Ideally?
Why?
Because they sponsor the black T-shirts.
They do.
If you want to do a pub test on your own, don't. Go to Ideally instead.
That's right. Visit goideally.com. That's goideally.com and find out how they can help. But it is interesting what you just said about
Google.
About pushing things to the edges. Because I think what we often do is we research something that's pretty safe. And I often wonder why we're researching it like it's safe, right?
Totally.
And so you don't get much learning. It's just sort of people think it's okay. Yeah. It doesn't offend them, but you don't learn anything. And I think it's interesting to go, don't test you don't need to test the safe thing.
No.
Just do the safe thing. But like, push it to the extremes, push it to the edges, really get people to sort of react,
This is one of the things that, like, in those early days of Ideally, like, sort of thinking, how do you create stuff that helps the creative process along? Like, one of the big killers is when research is expensive and it takes 3 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever, then there's a lot of stock in that. Like, a lot of people go, we've got to get this right, guys. So we can't be too out there, because if this comes back and we don't have anything to go with afterwards, then we're fucked, right? And so when you make research able to be done very, very quickly and very, very affordably, what that means is you can throw those ideas. There's not a lot riding on that.
That's a really nice insight. It's much more fluid and collaborative, because if you're doing a piece of cheap research that's very, very quick to do, you don't have the sunk costs in it. Whereas if you're spending $50,000 or 100,000 or $1 million or whatever, and it comes back and says, oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
You kind of have to justify that and then stop and reset.
Yeah.
I'm just amazed at how irresponsibly research is used when there's a beestick difference between option A and option B, and then you have to then stop what you're doing, reset, start again.
Yeah.
The amount of time, effort, resources get wasted, I think, with stuff that isn't going to make any material difference to the real world.
Yeah.
I find it absolutely fascinating. I've always found that fascinating. I couldn't believe what was happening.
You should try working in America. I mean, you're a proud Kiwi. That is one of the great things, and I worked over there for 5 years. I think one of the great things about the New Zealand market is because it doesn't have that big perceived sunk cost. Like the media is not as expensive. There's a fantastic experimentation.
Yep.
Let's just try stuff. The advertising industry certainly has that in New Zealand. Do you think it extends to other parts of the New Zealand economy as well? Like, is that a real New Zealand business trait, do you think, to really try things, experiment?
I think we tell ourselves that lots. I think we tell ourselves that lovely story of number 8 wire and kind of like how we're this wildly innovative country. I think if you look at our record outside of the advertising industry, where we do tend to over-index sometimes, and not every time, right? I think if you look outside of advertising, I'm not sure we have any claim to be any more innovative than any other country.
Do you remember that book from years ago, The Rise of a Creative Class, Richard Florida? About
I never read it, but I remember it.
And he mapped cities that kind of had creative spots with their kind of economic output. Has anybody done the same in kind of VC startup world and looked at, there's more coming out of New Zealand than there is from Australia per capita or anything like that? Do we know where the hot innovation places are?
Yeah, there's a global organisation called Startup Genome who do that. They go around and they study startup ecosystems all over the world and they rank them on various things. I mean, from what I remember, the creative class thing was quite interesting because it's like if you have like low rent, it brings in artists and like those sorts of people, and that kind of spurs. And it was really
high social security and all that kind of stuff. So you don't have to get a job; you can play around with ideas and stuff like that.
In the startup world, given that, it's still quite nascent. So when Startup Genome or these sorts of people that assess startup ecosystems, they tend to just look at the very specific stuff, like what's the government legislation or regulation or tax policy and those sorts of things, rather than looking at, as that guy did, on what are the broader kind of social environment, what impact does that have on the creativity and the output of people. That would be a very interesting thing to study.
James, with your skills in strategy, creative, and let's not forget IT, if you just could start it all again, and you're now in your early 20s and go, right, where I'm really going to play and where I'm going to get good at is this. What would you do if you could do
it over?
Yeah.
I always find that quite hard to answer because I'm really happy with where I am, and I would not have got here had I not followed that path, right? And so it's quite difficult to sort of go back in time. I think were I to do it again, I mean, I probably would have gotten into creating companies a bit earlier because I'd be way richer now. So there's that. I don't know. I just felt like I got to live through like the end of like the heyday of the advertising industry, which was just so much fun. And when I fell into IT, that did give me a whole lot of technical skills that actually have been very useful throughout my life. And not going to university and those sorts of things, really hasn't affected me negatively as far as I can tell. And so, I don't think I would do things any differently. I don't know whether I would encourage my kids to start in the advertising industry today. I think I'd probably encourage them to sort of do more like, I'd get them involved in entrepreneurialism probably.
Creative consultancy, maybe creative consultancy or something.
What about while you're thinking about life advice and stuff? What about to young strategists out there? What would be your one bit of advice to young strategists on how to get really good at it and how to really make a difference?
I mean, I'm aware that I haven't been a planner in an ad agency for a decade, and so things may have changed a little bit. But I think like if you can like do a few months as a creative, actually that's like so it was really useful. The relationship that you have with the creative department is a really, really important one, and how you kind of hone that and become so useful to them that they always want you in the room. But then on the other side, on the client side of the equation, I think how you learn to become really persuasive and how you learn to listen to them much, much more. Not read all the documents, but like actually listen to like what they really want and what they really need and what they, as humans, not as representatives of the business.
Yeah,
I think like the more you listen, the easier it is then to play that back in a way that lets them know, oh, you've listened, you understand what I really want or need. We're on the same page here, so I trust you. So when you say, I think we should go in this direction creatively, I know you're saying that because you really understand me and you're on my side. So I think that's super important.
You mentioned creatives, you mentioned clients, you didn't mention consumers.
That's interesting, isn't it?
They'll take what they're given.
Take what they're given. Yeah, that is interesting that I didn't mention consumers.
Do you think too much is made of that? You're the voice of the consumer and spend time with the consumers and,
I sort of think it is a little bit. I mean, but I would probably give the advice which my first boss gave me. And he told me to educate my intuition. And what he meant by that was spend lots and lots of time around people, not necessarily asking them anything, but just like listening. Again, it's the listening thing, and just getting a sense for them and like how they make decisions and how they behave, just generally, not sort of in this very specific way that we tend to go through with formal research processes. And he was like, over your career, you're going to have to make so many intuitive decisions. You have to make them all the time. And if your intuition is educated, then you can make those intuitive calls about what a consumer is going to respond to and what they're not going to. That's a very powerful skill to have, to not have to go and ask each time, but just have an innate understanding of that. And I think, if you think about all of the great creative people that you've interviewed on this podcast, like I would imagine that most of them has a really above average intuition for what people will love without necessarily needing to go and ask them. So I think developing that skill is useful.
Now, James Hurman, I don't think I've ever seen you not wear a black T-shirt. I've got one under, your uniform.
My hoodie.
You also, I think of anyone I know, are amazing at sound bites. You're so good at coming up with sound bites. So if I said to you, in a sound bite that you'd put on a black T-shirt, how would you sum up your creative philosophy? What would your black T-shirt be?
The best way to predict the future is to create it.
The best way to predict the future is to create it.
Is that a saying?
Yeah, I didn't just make that up.
No. Yeah, great. I like it. I thought you were going to say this is the most effective black T-shirt in the world. So I'll take your answer much more than that one. So thank you for that. James, what was fascinating about you before you came on was you're a strategist, but you're constantly doing crazy things. You're constantly inventing different products, different services. Where you've taken your creative juice is incredible, as well as being incredibly renowned in the effectiveness space, which is the kind of the boring, plonky bit of, the whole marketing gamut. So to be so creative and yet so profound at that is really interesting. The fact that you were the IT guy just blows
That's
my
the
mind.
bit that's staying with you of this whole conversation.
It really is, because that mind inside your head must be incredible. So thank you very much for sharing your wisdom.
I think I was pretty lost.
Yeah,
I'm not sure it's testament to much other than me having no idea what I was doing.
No, it's very good. Very impressive. Thank you very much.
James, always a pleasure.
Thank you, guys. That was awesome.
Thanks for coming on.
Hey, James Hurman, what a chap. I'm trying to think of what the word is when you're good at lots and lots of different things. You're like a Renaissance person.
A Renaissance man.
Yeah, there's multi-something rather.
He's a bit of a slashy, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's a bit of a planner slash
IT geek
slash IT guy slash venture capital guy slash creative guy slash, he's got a lot of different skills, that's for sure.
He does. And the ability to go from being one of the world leaders in effectiveness to being a brand-led VC guy to being kind of investing in research platforms. It's incredible how his creative mind is just firing all over the place.
But I sort of love that he has become this leader in marketing science and all the literature and research and things, and yet he's not a classically sort of trained, educated guy. It's from his curiosity and from his search for knowledge. And, it's if you compare it to someone like a Byron Sharp or a Mark Ritson, he's a very different sort of
That's interesting,
thinker.
Isn't it? And his curiosity and deep thinking has kind of led him to all of those kind of things. And what he was talking about the effectiveness of this little group of people around the world, and they're just really into looking at maps of effectiveness and where sales are heading and what's causing those. And he may be just kind of born with that and been exposed to it. There's a lesson in that, I think, for all of us.
And what is that?
Go with what you're interested in. And if you can get a business model out of what you're genuinely interested in, then God, you're lucky.
And he will say that, how happy he is and how he's
Yeah.
doing what he really wants to do, and he's definitely worked that out. I had the pleasure of working with him many years ago at Colenso, and the other thing about James is he is just so positive and excited about ideas. It's really infectious, and I think I can see why he's having the impact he's having.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Really good. All right.
Righto.
Good on you, mate.